Greetings, students. I wanted to take this opportunity to walk through a very important concept to really try to help us understand a little bit more about some of the things that we see and create difficulty in for us to be able to have dialogue. And so this is a training that I developed several years ago that is really designed to help us have a better understanding and having common language as we start to have deeper conversations about institutionalized, internalized racial oppression, internalized racial superiority. So we're looking at it through a cognitive behavioral approach to this lens. So bear with me as we walk through these slides, and hopefully it'll give you a better understanding of some of the things that we're up against as we think about what we're trying to do here. So basically what I'm trying to do here in this particular presentation is this. It's really kind of operationalizing some of these tools and concepts through the lens of cognitive behavior so that we can have a better understanding of why things are the way they are as it relates to racial relationships in our country and the socialization that has went into this particular process that has happened over several years or many decades that has us to be where we're at. So basically breaking down some of these abstract concepts to something that's more practical, then I think this helps us facilitate a much more meaningful dialogue as we kind of move forward. So I worked with and was trained by the Minnesota Collaborative Anti-Racist Initiative. It's a program that was around probably in the early 2000s. And they came in and did some work with the agency that I was working with at the time because we were moving in a direction of becoming an anti-racist organization. And we're a government organization as well. And so they taught us about these very two important concepts that I think that we're going to spend some time talking about today and try to break these down so that it becomes something that's palatable. And so the first one is internalized racial oppression. It's a complex, multi-generational socialization process that teaches people of color to believe and accept and live or act out negative societal definitions of self. So that's very important to understand that this is a complex process that just socializes people to look at negative interpretations of who it is they are. Conversely, we have internalized racial superiority. It's a complex, multi-generational socialization process that teaches white people to believe, act, accept, and to live superior to social definitions of self. So it's kind of like the yin and the yang in terms of these particular concepts, and they both need each other to survive. And so we'll talk a little bit about them in greater detail as we move forward. So part of the reason that, I developed this particular training in conjunction with the folks at MCARI was because as we were doing the larger work, becoming an anti-racist organization in our government institution, we would often get to these places where we would need to be having these dialogues and people would get stuck. So there was this incredible silence, or, people didn't know what to say. People were afraid to talk. I might say the wrong thing. Someone will think I'm racist. Someone will think I don't care. Will I come across as an angry person of color, those kind of things. So often what we found is in those really important meetings where meaningful dialogue really needed to occur, we got stuck because people got stuck into their heads, this whole notion of, being politically correct or not saying the wrong thing or not wanting to be perceived in a bad light. And so that often killed conversations pretty immediately. So out of part of my frustration, I thought about, well, what if we were to look at it a different way? And maybe this will make it a little bit easier for people to engage in the conversation. So the following is kind of where we're going with this. So I want to do a quick turnabout here and have you think about a cognitive behavioral approach. And so there's this concept in cognitive restructuring that really pretty much simply says that thinking controls behavior. So in essence, what this particular concept is saying to us is that all behavior is a result of a thought-driven process. No matter how we might think that we haven't put some thought into what it is we're deciding to actually do, it's happened and it's a process. We will talk about how that happens over time. So what I would normally do is challenge folks to think about this definition and see if there are any exceptions to whether this is accurate or not, whether thinking actually does control behaviors, with some qualifiers, of course, that with the exception of gross bodily functions, heartbeats, food digesting, breathing, heart beating, things of that particular nature, pretty much all the other things that we do that result in a behavior are, again, the result of a thought-driven process. So if you think of something that's outside of that, let me know. All right, so let's talk about these definitions real quick, because they're going to be important for us to really kind of understand the process. And so in cognitive restructuring, we talk about thoughts. We help people understand what they are, and the definitions are here for you to kind of take a look at. So the act of thinking or words that happen inside your head is a simpler way to do it. We talk about feelings also. We talk about the unique relationship between thoughts and feelings. And that's the ability to react or feel emotion or sensations. We talk about attitudes. So we look at the state of mind with a feeling in regard to some particular matter. So, you know, I may have an attitude or a particular feeling or state of mind about a particular political group that may have ideology that's different than mine. And so automatically, when you bring up that particular political faction, then my mind already goes back to, based on my attitude, what I already feel about it. So I'm not real open to letting in any new information about that particular organization. And that's oftentimes to my detriment. So also we have this whole notion of beliefs. So it's the mental act or condition of placing faith, trust, confidence in the person, place, thing, situation. So as many of you are, for example, sitting down and watching this particular video, many of you are sitting in chairs or on a couch, or in terms of looking at your laptop and looking at the particular presentation that's there. I'd be willing to bet that nobody actually checked the chair that they were sitting in to make sure that it would support their weight. You had a mental act or condition or confidence that the chair would hold your weight because it held your weight yesterday. So there's no need for me to actually challenge that. So beliefs are these ingrained pieces of conditioning that help us really think about or not to think about some of the things that we actually do or where they come from. And then we have what we call these thinking patterns. So these are habitual patterns of thought that are reinforced by time and by experience. So we understand these particular definitions, and then we see what they look like when they're all together. This is a tool that we call the cognitive structure. It's a diagram that we use to really help folks really understand who it is they are in terms of how we are all unique individuals, and we are basically the sum total of our thoughts and feelings from the time that we're born to the time that we die. We have thoughts and feelings about everything that we experience through our five senses. They are stored away in our brains for later retrieval because we'll need that information to actually maneuver and go on through life. So these particular thoughts, if you think about a computer file, think about the thoughts and feelings as the information that you input into the keyboard to put into the hard drive. That forms your attitudes, your beliefs, and your thinking patterns. So your state of mind in regards to certain things. So if you were taught early on that, for example, boys did certain types of things and girls did not. And if you were taught that, not that it's right or wrong, and you have thoughts about that and you have feelings about that and you subscribe to that particular piece, then you're going to have an attitude that really supports that particular thing that you have been taught. And you're going to have a belief that supports the things you've been taught. And the way that you think about things will also support that as well, too. So if you got thoughts, feelings, become your attitudes, your beliefs, and your thinking patterns, and they also do something very important for us. So what happens is that based on these thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes and thinking patterns that we have about all the things that we know about that have been established over time, that determines how we actually respond to a given situation. So in other words, what we call those are mindsets, or those are things that we experience that are repeated over time. And when we find ourselves in those particular situations, we just automatically respond, seemingly without thinking about it. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So let's say we have a 2.5-year-old that is at home who is exploring his world, as we know that toddlers sometimes do. And he makes his way into the kitchen and he notices on top of the stove, there is this pretty blue thing that is kind of jumping around. And he's interested. He's wanting something to play with. And so he finds a way to pull devices over, not being supervised, I might add, to the stove where he can stand up and actually grab this pretty blue thing to play with it. Well, we all know that this pretty blue thing on a gas stove is a flame. We also know that it's hot. So what happens is the child reaches, grabs the flame, burns himself. So at the point in time that this particular burn happens for this child, there's a thought that happens inside of that child's mind that's associated with a feeling of pain and anguish that happens when we get burned. So he might scream out in pain. Hopefully parents will come in and take care of them. And from that point on, that child has had a very important learning in a few milliseconds about the importance of, or the danger of, or the consequence of actually playing with the pretty blue thing. So at this particular point, this child develops an attitude or belief about the pretty blue thing on the stove, which is a flame that can hurt you. As a result of that particular process that happens, tomorrow, when this child is in the kitchen with its bandaged arm, and he looks on top of the stove and sees the pretty blue thing, the chances are very remote or very low that he will reach up and touch it again, because he has this particular attitude now that's been based on an experience and a thought and a feeling that he had about what's happening when you play with that. So that's just kind of an oversimplification of how the cognitive structure works, how the learning pieces work for all of us, and how that information is stored away for later use. And this is important stuff that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So when we think about the section of the cognitive structure called mindsets, these are your attitudes, beliefs, and thinking patterns that have been learned and reinforced over time. So interestingly enough, everybody has mindsets. If you have an opinion about something or how you think something should go, you have a mindset. These mindsets come from any number of experiences that we may have had, learnings from our family of origin, our own experiences with the particular subject matter. And so these mindsets that we develop over time actually define and determine how we act and how we live. They tell us what's right, they tell us what's wrong, they tell us what we should do, they tell us what we shouldn't do. The interesting thing about these mindsets, or this particular cognitive aspect of this particular structure, is that everyone has mindsets. Every person on the planet who's alive and breathing has them. The interesting thing about mindsets, though, are that they are not right or they are not wrong, but they do affect how people act and react. So that's an important piece to remember, that mindsets in and of themselves are value neutral in terms of that. So you're probably wondering about, what might an example of that be? So let's take something that we've seen in the news happen time and time again, and I'm going to do some generalizations. So to give you an example how the mindset piece works. So we have an African-American man driving in a car. All right, he's driving in a part of town, and he has been stopped previously by the police for minor infractions or what have you. And so he's in the process of driving down the street. And he's in a particular part of town where, there's a high likelihood that he may be stopped. So sure enough, like clockwork, he's driving through this neighborhood and he's pulled over. And so the mindset starts to kick in. And so keeping in mind that this person has been pulled over, 10, 15 times in the last year or so. And so as he's remembering or referencing those particular thoughts, he has this mindset about an attitude about maybe the police, they're pulling him over, and has certain beliefs about the police maybe pulling him over because of his race or the color of his skin or driving while he's black. And so as he sits and waits for the officer to approach the car, in his mind, he may be very well becoming annoyed and upset because this is the 15th time that I've been pulled over, and I know that I wasn't doing anything wrong. I haven't broken the law. So I can easily see this person starting to become agitated and to get angry. So by the time the police officer gets to the car, I probably worked myself up, or this person has worked themselves up into this really negative attitude and may actually take that out on the officer that is trying to actually serve him the citation. So that's one aspect of it. And so if we remember that all people have mindsets, I want you to think about what might be happening for the police officer. So, it's a cold day. You've had a very busy shift. You're working and you see a lot of horrific things that take place in the course of your day. And so now you're driving down the street, you're minding your own business, you're on patrol, you're looking for criminal activity, and here's a person who bumps the stop sign. In other words, does a rolling stop, doesn't bother to stop and roll through that particular piece. And so now I'm thinking that here's another person that doesn't know what STOP means. So I'm already a little bit aggravated. I've already seen a lot of different things that have happened today, and I'm not in a real good place. And so I'm not having maybe the best of attitudes or mindsets about folks. And then I happen to notice that the driver of the vehicle is African American. And so now it raises some other bells and whistles, because in my socialization process, most of the time when I encounter people who are maybe African American and they're male, they tend to be dangerous, or at least perceived to be that particular way. So I need to probably use extra caution as I'm approaching this particular car, but I'm pretty much looking for something to happen that probably shouldn't happen. And so as I walk up towards the car, I'll probably already have somewhat of an attitude based on my mindset about folks of this particular persuasion, and thus the potential explosion can happen. So as you can see, you've got a driver who's got a thought process about being pulled over by police officers for no reason or because he's Black. And then you've got an officer who's pulling over people doing his job, but also has some information, true or untrue, about people of color and what their tendencies are as he pulls them over. So as you can see, it becomes kind of the perfect recipe for disaster when we have these mindsets that we have that go unchecked. So just an example in terms of something to think about. So when we think about it from this cognitive behavioral lens, we got to accept that, IRS, IRO, and these are just short acronyms for internalized racial oppression, internalized racial superiority, that they are actually mindsets. And they are value neutral. That's the hard part, I think, that sometimes people get in their head, because you're thinking, well, if I'm thinking badly about someone, then how can that be something that's neutral? I would say that if you haven't acted on what you might be thinking, then it's a non-issue. So in other words, you can be the greatest bank robber of all times in your mind and have all these plans laid out about how you're going to go into Wells Fargo and relieve them of millions of dollars. The FBI, no one will ever show up at your door until you actually put your particular plan in action and attempt to rob the bank. That's when it becomes a problem. So as long as it's here in your head, taking up space, it's not an issue because you haven't acted on it. The moment you act on it, it becomes a different story. So again, if we think about how mindsets define how we act and live, but they also, as I just kind of demonstrated in the scenario that we just talked about with a Black person being pulled over by the police officer, that mindsets do affect how people act and then how they react. So if I think that I perceive you to be a threat, then you're a threat. If I perceive you to be harassing me, then you're harassing me. So if we move into those particular realms, we need to understand and also recognize that these mindsets, this institutionalized, internalized racial superiority, the attitudes, beliefs, thinking patterns are reinforced by time and experience that cause white people to respond and behave automatically. So if I'm put in certain situations, I automatically know what I'm going to do based on those particular things, what I've been taught, what I've learned, what my experiences have been, whether they are accurate, legitimate or not, but they will move me into a behavior that's pretty much automatic in terms of how I might respond. Also, when we are looking at IRO, internalized racial oppression, these attitudes, beliefs, thinking patterns reinforced by time and experience that cause people of color to respond and behave automatically. So we, have come to a place where it's like, oh, I know how this situation is going to play out. I've been here before. There's a difference in terms of race here, and chances are I will probably not come out on the upper end of that. And while that might be a harsh way to think about things, but that's a reality for people oftentimes who are of minority status or a marginalized group in terms of how the process works itself out. So we need to also just recognize that this mindset piece, let me go back here, is very important and prevalent. And so it's the result of years and years of socialization through the media, through family of origin, through our own experiences, through many different lenses, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt, but it helps to create the mindset that we all have about how we see and experience difference and then how we subsequently respond to it. So just really wanted to make sure that we drive that piece home, because I think that if we really understand and really look at this particular aspect of this particular scenario, then we can actually recognize that, maybe it is a little bit easier to talk about because we've been socialized to be that way. And so, it doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong with me. It's just that I grew up in a world that socialized me to see things the way that I see them. And that's the particular issue. So hopefully with that, folks are able to recognize, understand, and accept these particular facts. And then it becomes a little bit easier to have some of those difficult conversations that we've been avoiding because we don't know what to say. So in a lot of ways, this means that we're all victims. And we could literally put any form of privilege and oppression into these mindset and come out with the same thing. So it could be sexism, it could be ageism, it could be all of the isms that we have talked about. We're going to talk about class. We could talk about sexual orientation, the whole 9 yards. All of this fits into these particular categories because we've all been taught or all have attitudes and thinking patterns that have been reinforced by time and experience that cause us to see things the way that we see them, respond the way that we respond, and to do it automatically. So just to keep those pieces in mind. Also recognizing that socialization is a very, very important process. We're socialized by our sustaining environments. We're socialized to reinforce what we learn in our own experiences, and to maximize our individual potential to succeed as we try to navigate this world around us. So again, keep in mind, IRS and IRO are part of who we are, not good or bad, but does impact how we treat others and how we respond to others and how others respond to us. So to keep those things in mind as we move forward. So I'd like to just kind of end with just a little conclusion. That this is a euphemism that I heard many times from some of my elders in the southern parts of the United States where I grew up. And the older folks would always say, we all do better when we all do better. And so with that, I thank you for your time and attention during this particular video lecture. And hopefully there's some things that have been said here that cause you to think about some of the things that we see playing themselves out in our world and our media, and even for ourselves as we interface with difference. As we navigate the dangerous journey that sometimes is a part of our world. Thank you.